Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Nicholas Blincoe. Nicholas is an author, critic, and screenwriter. He works for a number of outlets in Britain, but more importantly, he wrote two amazing books. In fact, one of them was probably my favorite book during the pandemic. So the first one, published in 2017, Bethlehem, Biography of a Town. But more importantly for today's talk, the book published in 2019, More Noble Than War, the story of football in Israel and Palestine. But beware, there's also the American version of it. Yes, because football does mean something different across the ocean. So for the American audience, More Noble Than War is the same, but a soccer history of Israel-Palestine. Nicholas, welcome.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Roberto. I'm so pleased to be here.
Nicholas, one of the striking features of your book about football, and we should agree to call it football as we are both Europeans, even though I'm sitting in America, so, we might switch to soccer here and there, is that you're starting the book talking about yourself living in Bethlehem. And so I'm very curious to know how you got to live in Bethlehem. But more importantly, you're saying openly that before that experience, you didn't like or didn't love football, which is quite strange considering you're British. I know this is a bit of a stereotype, but it works for me too as an Italian. So Nicholas, what is your connection with football? How did it develop? And of course, how did you, connected before? How did you connect before with Bethlehem?
Well, I connected with Bethlehem through the most romantic way possible. I fell in love with a girl from Bethlehem. We were both studying philosophy at Warwick University in England. I'd been so deep into questions of philosophy, the dialectical materialism and speculative questions, that I really think the whole intifada had passed me by. I mean, I was that much of an idiot. And I met Layla Sansor and we fell in love. And I went to Palestine. And really, my first trip to Palestine coincided with Yasser Arafat's renewed trip to Palestine. So my first experience was of Bethlehem was seeing Yasser Arafat give a speech from the roof of the Church of the Nativity. And it was an exciting and optimistic time, and the optimism died quite quickly. By 2002, Layla, my wife, my then wife, I'm afraid we're divorced now, but she was making a film, and we were really living in Bethlehem by that point, because she made a film called Jeremy Hardy versus the Israeli Army, and then made a second film about Bethlehem itself. And I was living with her, and I just kind of, I loved living in Bethlehem, but at the same time, I was, as you might expect, a little bit homesick. And I was notionally a Manchester City fan. This dates back to I've got to confess, I was a raver. So the rave years in Manchester, I went to Hacienda all the time, but Manchester City were the big team in the part of Manchester that I lived in. So I was notionally a Manchester City fan. But I hadn't really played football as a kid because I've got very bad eyesight. I think, in fact, I was a bit dyspraxic when I was a kid, and I just could not kick a ball, hit a ball, and I wasn't going to get interested in a game that just defeated me. But living in Bethlehem as a kind of 35-year-old, 40-year-old, I was homesick. I started looking at Manchester City again. And really, what got me into it, oddly, was the politics, because Manchester City was going through a crazy, crazy time. We were bought by the Thailand MP who was on the run, Thaksin Shinawatra. And it was so crazy. And I began to see that football wasn't just a game, it was a kind of capitalist soap opera. It was the most kind of fascinating insight into world politics. And in fact, later on, I got deeply into football, and I see Manchester City play as often as possible. And I'm obsessive about strategy and tactics. But I've got to admit, I came late to the table. And luckily, I'm watching the greatest, perhaps one of the greatest teams ever assembled in Manchester City. So I find football so exhilarating, so wonderful, and so full of strategy and tactics and personal stories. But I've never forgotten that it's also all about politics, and it reveals something about a place. And so when I was looking for something to do, a way to write a history of Bethlehem and Palestine, I settled on this idea that football is also a way into the issues, and in many ways a better way than many others. Quite often when we give a political history, we look at the larger political organizations, and especially on the Israeli side, the political groupings were formed in Europe. And even on the Palestinian side, some of the major political groupings were formed in Syria or relate to a larger socialist idea or a pan-Arab idea or various other ideas that stretch beyond Palestine. But when you get down to the sports clubs, they're actually set up, half of them are set up by political parties, and the other ones are set up by things like church groups or friendly associations or mosque groups. And so it's immediately the politics of the place and how people organize themselves on the ground, day to day. And quite quickly, you find out that the major politicians were members of these sporting groups, and some of them played football. And football very quickly became the major obsession of all of the sporting clubs and associations. Boxing too, but football especially. So that was how I got into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how, sometimes someone just out of nothing can develop such a love for a sport. And I must say that actually I'm an admirer of Manchester City, and I was probably more in the past, particularly the years of Mancini and Balotelli, mostly because of fellow Italians, and obviously all of the controversies about Balotelli. But obviously we're not here to talk about Manchester City.
Yeah, Balotelli, I can talk about it all day.
I would love to. But I want to talk about the development of football in Palestine, particularly starting from the very beginning, so the late 19th century, the early 20th century. Like in my own work, working on late Ottoman Jerusalem, I came across even some pictures and stories about some of the earlier clubs, mostly established by British, living in the city and connected to the church, the Anglican Church of St. George. But that would be just like one simple example, but there was more to it. And eventually, particularly throughout the early 20th century, football became very prominent across the spectrum of the population living in Palestine, so the international, obviously, but also with the new arrivals of the Zionists from different European countries, but also amongst the local Palestinians. So I was wondering if you can give us a sense of this developing history at the beginning of the 20th century, and how football, as you already talked about politics, became a tool for one own group. How football was used to promote some sort of idea of belonging to a specific group.
Yes, it is fascinating because the history of football is kind of exactly the same length as the history of the conflict, and they do keep in step in a peculiar way. Unlike everything in Israel and Palestine, there's a dual narrative. On the Palestinian side, as you say, the first team was associated with the school of St. George Cathedral, which is an Anglican school, in some ways a feeder school for the college in Alexandria that Edward Said, for instance, went to. So that formed the first teams, and significant Palestinian politicians played for it because they went to this school. And if they didn't go, they had relatives who went, because it seems that prominent Palestinian families from Jerusalem seem to spread their children out between the different European schools. So, for instance, the guy who became the Mufti of Jerusalem, his cousin was at St. George's School, and it seems that he watched them. And then another school, there was another Anglican school up in Haifa. They started playing them. They started sending teams to play the Protestant school in Beirut, which became the American University of Beirut. Very quickly, this was the early 1900 to 1910 was a real time for Palestinian nationalism. So there was a Palestinian nationalist school started. They immediately started a football team. The Palestinian newspaper in Jaffa, they sponsored a football team. So really, before the First World War, there was a lively Palestinian football scene. On the Jewish side, football was really less important. There's some famous photographs of people, of football teams from the Jewish Sports Association in Jaffa. But the main focus before the First World War, was on a kind of martial style exercise thing. So they were marching up and down, doing calisthenics, really. It was more like calisthenics and gymnastics. And they were led by a guy called, I've forgotten his name, Zvi something or other, who was a Jewish convert, in fact. He was from an unusual Russian Christian sect who were Sabbatarians. They believed that the Sabbath should be moved to the Jewish Sabbath, and they adopted other Jewish practices because they were, Christians who were going back to their roots. They became so unpopular in Tsarist Orthodox Russia that a large community went to Palestine, and they were called Subbutniks. And quite a lot of the famous Jewish institutions, the army, as well as the sporting club, the Maccabis, were formed by these Subbutniks, who kind of gradually gave up Christianity and became assimilated Jews. So they were really, the Maccabi Sports Association started as a kind of more of a gymnastics, marching up and down, preparation for being soldiers, a kind of very martial Cub Scout type of organization. And it was only really in the 1920s that they started taking football seriously, which reflected that there was a new kind of Jew coming to Palestine, now that it was a lot safer. It was established by the British as a Jewish homeland. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was in disarray, so people were worried about their futures and looking for a new place to live. So there was a wave of new immigration to what Britain had designated as the Jewish homeland in Palestine, and they were coming from the industrialized cities of the ex-Austro-Hungarian Empire. And unlike the Russians, they had played football before and loved football. So the big sports association like the Maccabis, got more into football because the kids they were looking to recruit were getting more into football. But also almost immediately, about 1925, 1926, there was a huge argument in the football community, which reflects an argument in the Jewish political community between what was the nascent Labour Party under Ben Gurion and the old Maccabees, which were under the old Russians who'd set up the community in Jaffa, which became Tel Aviv ultimately. And it's a classic landlords and factory owners conflict with the new workers. And the Labour Party wanted to set up its own sports team. So they basically poached the youth team of the Maccabi of Jaffa, and they became the first Labour Party team. And yeah, that even today, that they're two of the greatest, oldest and best of the Israeli football clubs. And these new Jewish workers brought in a new kind of football. So they were better at playing football than anybody had been up until that point, and it became a much more fast, free-flowing game. At the time, possibly the greatest football club in Europe was a Jewish team from Vienna, so who toured Palestine. So they're called Hakoah, Viennese Hakoah, which is a Jewish team. And Hakoah visited Tel Aviv and played an exhibition match with both the Maccabi side and the rival Labour side. And football really took off amongst the Jews of Palestine in pre-state Israel. But at the same time, Palestinian football had been in the doldrums a bit, but that too was improving, and more teams were emerging. There were the big political newspapers on the Palestinian side were all happy to support teams, and the new Palestinian Youth Party sponsored a cup. So there was lively competition on both sides, but they didn't really play each other. And the British wanted to encourage them to play each other. So set up what would be the equivalent of the FA Cup for Palestine. And this is where the story starts to get both murky and underhand, in that it was the Maccabees who were given the authority by the British to set up this competition, and they grabbed it with both hands. The leader of the Maccabees at the time had just failed to get onto the Olympic Committee because they pointed out that he wanted a Jewish-only organization, and that didn't reflect the makeup of Palestine. And football became a new route. He was a gymnast. He wasn't particularly interested in football, but it became a new route for him to get international recognition for a Jewish society in Palestine, and it would be a recognition that recognized it as the leader of sports of Palestine. He applied to FIFA, which at the time was only 20 years old, and told them he was running the FA Cup. We know that he made up a lot of the teams that were going to participate in this cup. They just didn't exist. He also claimed that there was going to be Arab-Palestinian participation, and he claimed that an Arab-Palestinian was at the meeting. It seems to me, from all the evidence, that the guy just wasn't there. If he'd had any kind of conversation, he didn't go back. And in fact, the minutes of the meeting are in Hebrew, which he would not understand. So there was an entirely fictitious application made to FIFA, and FIFA accepted the Maccabees as the Palestinian FA. And they were called the Palestine FA in English, and in Hebrew they were called Eretz Israel Football Association. And they really ran the leagues through the 30s, which meant again that Palestinians pretty much boycotted them, and they were very, very I mean, this is one of the problems of writing a history, I found. It always had to be a dual narrative because there were very, very few occasions where they both played each other. And really, there aren't any leagues that feature both until the Second World War, which is a very, very special situation that the Palestinians wound up their own leagues after the general strike. The British put pressure on the Jewish side to welcome them. And there's quite a lot of army sides too, because although Palestine was thoroughly militarized during the Second World War, in fact, there wasn't much action there. There was plenty of time for sporting endeavors and military sporting endeavors. And the Palestinian, and I believe the Jewish sides too, would do charity matches and send money off to the war issue. So there's just a kind of tiny period in the Second World War where there's British military sides, Jewish sides, and Palestinian sides all playing together, but otherwise they tend not to, except for one special exception, which is oddly Beitar Jerusalem. But perhaps we'll talk about that later.
It looks like the British essentially replicated with football what they did with politics and economic development. They chose one side, they supported one side, essentially not necessarily against the other, but with better tools and sort of providing them with a better infrastructure.
Well, I would say it was much more deliberate than that. I mean, there might have been a lot of British people and a lot of British administrators who were simply supporting one side without particularly going into it. But there were clear major supporters of it. I don't have my book in front of me, so my recollection for names is always terrible. But there was a British industrialist and aristocrat who funded the Palestine FA when it was Jewish run, but he was also part of FIFA and he was part of the FA in England, and he worked very hard to get the Palestine FA to form a national team. For instance, the national team was in fact the Maccabi side, Tel Aviv Maccabi rebranded. But once they did call themselves Palestine FA, he underwrote tours around the world. So you had very, very influential, powerful people choosing, with international connections, choosing the Jewish side and helping create the impression that they were the only national side in Palestine.
But as you said earlier, essentially there were two narratives. Like there was obviously one Jewish, one Palestinian. Yeah. And I was wondering, if you also can give us a sense of who are the football players, where are the people playing on both sides, and also where did they play? Because some of the stadiums are still recognizable nowadays, but obviously I suppose that some of the football pitches that gave birth to football in Palestine, both of the Arab and the Jew Zionists, might have disappeared at some point.
Well, yes. I mean, this is a wonderful question. The most famous stadium there's two famous stadiums, I would say, old stadiums. The first one is the YMCA stadium in Jerusalem. The YMCA was built in the 1920s as part of the YMCA spreading out around the world. It was, I believe, American Christian money, but it quickly became a club where the wealthiest Jerusalem Arabs would go and play tennis. It was where they met and mingled with the British and British authorities. And so it's one of the areas where a well-to-do Palestinian would feel kind of at one with the British authorities, and at least in the 1920s, before things really turned violent. The 1920s are surprisingly peaceful, I think. You could correct me on that, but that was my impression. And certainly, if you played tennis, if you were well-to-do, you went to the YMCA. Well, the YMCA also had a football pitch, so people started playing football there. And the British military sides played there. And the first league was a British military league that welcomed a few local sides in. The Jerusalem Police Force, for instance. Jerusalem Police Force was predominantly Jewish, but there were Palestinian policemen at the time. So that's an important stadium, and it becomes increasingly important in the 1930s and 40s when a league restarts. And I'll come back to that when we talk about Beitar. The other big stadium is the one which now is the stadium for Maccabi Tel Aviv. But at the time, Maccabi Tel Aviv played in off one of the main, I've forgotten the name of the main street in that I'm thinking of in Tel Aviv. But they played at the top of Tel Aviv, close to where the market is. Then, as Tel Aviv expanded to the north, the stadium moved further north. And Yosef Yekatieli, who I didn't mention him by name earlier, but he was the guy who set up the Palestinian Football Association under the sponsorship of British industrialists. He was also involved in town planning in Tel Aviv. So he would set up stadiums and housing around the stadiums, and it became a way to kind of build neighborhoods. So the Maccabi Tel Aviv stadium did move a few times, but now it's in Jaffa, and the reason it's in Jaffa is that that's the stadium that the Jaffa Palestinian Arab teams used. It used to hold a kind of Palestinian national games in the 1930s. It was sponsored by the Palestinian Youth Party, and it was used to sponsor the equivalent of an FA Cup that the Palestinians tried to get going in the early 1930s. And I mean, like the story of so many things in Palestine and Israel, it was captured in 1948 and very quickly became the major stadium for the state of Israel. And the money to turn it into a modern stadium came from a Canadian Jewish health fund. So shall we talk about Beitar and what happened at the YMCA?
Well, let's move to Jerusalem. Let's talk about Beitar Jerusalem, such a controversial team with a very interesting, fascinating story and very much connected to politics. So where is this team from? I mean, who are the people involved in the establishment, and why is such a controversial team?
Well, I mean, right from the start, Beitar were a very controversial political party. It's not talked about much in Israel, but the founders of Beitar were the people who set up the Jewish Fascist Party of Palestine in the late 20s. Major figures in Beitar had been in Italy. The leader of the Stern Gang was recruited while he was a student in Italy, and he was a fascist supporter. The Jewish Fascist Party was behind the march, a march in 1929 to what was then called the Wailing Wall, and it was one of the catalysts for the attempt by people in Hebron to get to Jerusalem a couple of weeks, the week afterwards, to try and confront the Jewish nationalists of the time. And their failure to get to Jerusalem led to the attack on the yeshiva in Hebron, which now is remembered as the Hebron Massacre. So this small group of people who were fascist sympathizers living in Jerusalem and ultimately became Beitar were already exerting a huge amount, having an effect way beyond their numbers, which were fairly small. And there's a variety of reasons for this. One is that they were fairly well educated, they were extremely right-wing, and they got control of a paper that hitherto had been like the Daily Mail, the Hebrew version of the Daily Mail, but they took control of it in the 1930s. And they formed Beitar Jerusalem, the sporting club that was kind of the social association of the political party, and also the youth club of the political party, which was a common way of doing politics at the time. You'd have the political party, but then you would also have the youth wing. They quickly affiliated with Beitar, which was a big political party in Poland and had branches across Europe. But when we tell the history of Beitar, we tend to tell it as this kind of European-wide global story of a political association. It doesn't really tell us what Beitar Jerusalem was like, because it was separate, clearly, from geography, distance, and sea. It was separate from Europe, and it had its own leaders, and it had its own newspaper, and it had its own football team. But another thing that happened, it was actually separate from the rest of Palestine. All of the Jewish cities were on the coast, and Jerusalem, especially by 1936 in the general strike, was really cut off. There was no football leagues because you simply couldn't get football coaches traversing the country to any kind of timetable, because they'd be stopped in roadblocks all of the time. So the leagues were just abandoned, and the Jewish side, they just ran a small football league around the Tel Aviv area. So Beitar Jerusalem, this youth side, an extremely right wing and associated really with fascists, and people like Stern continued to be associated with fascists and using that title for themselves when other people had abandoned it. They oddly started playing British and Palestinian sides because they were the only people you could play in Jerusalem. And there was a cup called the Flowers Cup. One of the gates in Jerusalem is called Flowers Gate in Hebrew, or the Hebrew word translates as Flowers Gate. And which gate is that? That's I can't remember which gate it is. It's the one by the Palestine Museum, what's now called the Rockefeller Museum. So there was a football league, and Beitar Jerusalem played in it. And as the general strike went on, obviously it degenerated into violence, and you've got the British cracking down in various ways on the Palestinian side. But there was a wave of violence from Beitar, and it was the Jerusalem Beitar that was doing it. And they pioneered car bombs, and some of their car bombs killed so many people. There just hadn't been terrorism activity that as destructive as this anywhere, really. So the British were trying to crack down on Beitar Jerusalem, but they thought the best way of infiltrating them was to allow the football to continue and plant police spies in the crowd to try and identify people like Stern. So football continued in order to spy on Beitar Jerusalem, and all of the games happened in the YMCA stadium. And one of the reasons that the YMCA stadium became the stadium for the Jewish side was that again, Jerusalem was much more religious than the rest of the country, religious as a Jewish city. And the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Jerusalem just simply did not allow football to be played on a Saturday. This continues to be a problem today. They would just stop the matches. So the Jewish football teams that existed besides Beitar Jerusalem couldn't play because Jewish ultra-Orthodox protesters stopped them from playing. But Beitar Jerusalem didn't care about this and continued playing at the YMCA. And eventually they were banned, but they created the 1930s created the legend of the first side of Beitar, and then most of Beitar people, certainly in Jerusalem, ended up getting sent away during the war. If they weren't arrested, they were sent to prison camps in Africa or prison somewhere underground, and there did continue to be terrorist campaigns through the Second World War. But on the whole, Beitar Jerusalem just ceased to exist, and it was revived in 1948, 1949 with this myth of being the fighting side. And I think one of the odd things about Beitar Jerusalem, as we talk about it today, is that it's founded on a myth, but it's not really the people who created the myth who are the supporters anymore. It's Mizrahi Jews who kind of got plonked in Jerusalem and loved football anyway, because football spread out all over the Middle East, and Arab speakers, whether they're ethnic Arab or Jewish Arab speakers, just love football. So Mizrahi Jews were dumped in quite windy, cold housing estates in Jerusalem and started supporting the local team, Beitar Jerusalem, which were a very second-rate team for 20 years. From 1948 through to 1968, they were just a local bad side, fed on right-wing ideas of being the fighting side, of being the only Jerusalem side, of being this. Everyone else was a traitor because there is no Zionism without Jerusalem. Zion means Jerusalem. So and all of the other football teams in the country were just simply leftists who were sunning themselves on the beach rather than living in Jerusalem. And in 1968, for the first time, Beitar managed to get into the top flight, and in a sense haven't looked back since.
You talked about already one of the most important controversies about Beitar Jerusalem, which is this group known as La Familia, which can translate the family, which is problematic in many ways, and just going beyond the question of hooliganism and obviously the sort of racism that is embedded. But you already mentioned the fact that this group is essentially made up of Mizrahi Jews, so Jews of Arab origins. But one of the sort of main themes that sort of bring together this group of people, and according to some of the observers, they do represent nearly 30% of the supporters of Beitar Jerusalem, is that they don't want Arabs to play for Beitar Jerusalem. Now, obviously, this is like a paradox in Israeli society, which also dates back the very origin of the state, when Mizrahi Jews were first ostracized, considered as a potential fifth column within the state, and sort of brainwashed to give up their own Arab identity, despite the fact that they're obviously Arabs. But and in the book, you talk about it, that you actually some sort of embedded and talked to members of La Familia. And so I was wondering if you can tell us, who are these people? What do they want? And where is their strength? And why do they still exist, despite all of the various actions taken by both the team itself, so the club, it's a bit shady here, obviously, but also the Israeli football associations. So what is La Familia? Why do they still out there?
Well, La Familia are the Beitar Jerusalem ultras. Unlike all ultras, they're essentially a kind of criminal organization. A criminal organization that because football is a very dodgy industry, the clubs tend to tolerate. And why do I say they're criminal? Well, a lot of it's to do with tickets. La Familia can sell tickets, buy tickets, spread tickets to supporters, and they can fill up stadiums. They're regarded as the keenest fans, and they get preferential treatment off the clubs, which turn a blind eye to things like their scalping organizations, and well, often protection rackets. And it's not, I don't know if you know now that Beitar Jerusalem plays in a stadium called the Teddy Stadium, which is it's by a mall in the part of Jerusalem that's right next to Bethlehem. In fact, you can see the stadium from the highest point in Bethlehem. Well, until very recently, the owners of Beitar Jerusalem gave the La Familia rooms inside where they had their clubhouse, and which they also had a gym. So they were a social club who were so much part of a fabric of the club that you couldn't really extricate them from the club. They regarded themselves and were accepted by the club as representing the real heart, and the racism is part of it. The banner says "Forever Pure," which means that they've only ever had Jewish players, which is untrue. That they've had players from around the world, and they've had Muslim players, but they've never had Palestinian Arab players, which is unusual in Israel. Almost all of the other teams have had, to an extent, if Arab Palestinians playing for them. So La Familia, even the name La Familia is such a stupid joke. I mean, you're obviously Italian, you know they spelt it wrong. They've taken it from gangster films without really understanding how to spell it, what it means. It's like calling themselves the Mafia or the Godfather. But it does hark back to this myth of Beitar as being the fighting family. The term fighting family emerged in 1948 because there were actually several right-wing. By the end of the war, there'd been a variety of splits within the Beitar terrorist groups, and there were more than one Beitar associated terrorist groups. And after they all got together to try and form the new party Likud, well, the forerunner of Likud, they kind of buried the hatchet and started calling themselves the fighting family, which glossed over all of the arguments between them. And I think it's always been my hunch that they called themselves La Familia to harken back to Beitar being the fighting family of Jerusalem, on top of thinking themselves the Corleones of Jerusalem because they are a crime family. And they were raided. When I wrote the book, that year they were raided. So what are we talking about, like 2018 now? And it was unbelievable how many weapons, they found weapons and explosives. I mean, they're a really heavily armed group. The headline news, I guess, these days is that La Familia apparently don't have the power they had in their heyday. They no longer, I believe they no longer have rooms inside the Collect Stadium that they regard as their own and have access to. And I believe they're no longer allowed to unfurl the flag, which is the Forever Pure flag. And this is because there are new tech owners of the club who've also oddly tried to reach out to Gulf investors, which fell through. But even the fact that it was tried for a little while, which is just remarkable. I mean, the previous owner of Beitar Jerusalem had briefly changed the name of the club to Beitar Trump Jerusalem to celebrate the fact that Donald Trump had moved the embassy to Jerusalem and declared that the city was whole. This was the last act of the previous owners, and on changing its name, he immediately sold it. The name change was quietly forgotten. The new owners said they were going to get rid of La Familia, bought in various backers, including a Gulf backer, and although that fell through, it's still remarkable. So I guess we're going to have to wait and see whether La Familia continue to exert the kind of influence they have in the past. But I mean, we see in Hungary, especially, as well as Italy, this week in Holland, in Rotterdam, just how strong ultras are within a football club. And I think they're impossible to root out. As ticket prices have shot up in value, and as it's difficult to get tickets for stadiums, groups that can supply tickets to the hardcore fans are always going to have a place, but and clubs aren't likely to stamp down on them. So I don't know what the future of La Familia is. I find it very difficult to believe that they're going to disappear.
It is the same, I guess, as you mentioned in other countries. You have these groups, they do exist. Some have been marginalized depending on the policies of the various governments. We saw that in Italy. We certainly saw that in Britain in the 1990s. But they still exist, and it's hard to kind of fully remove them because they provide certain services, again, selling tickets to hardcore fans, and maybe at cheaper prices, but then they do other things. And so just increasing the prices is not good enough. And I think politics is inherently connected with football. I mean, there's a relationship, and politicians do understand that, and they may disappear from football stadiums for a while, but then when they need, they go back because they know that they can get votes out of that stadiums. And so I think you're right.
That's especially true of Beitar Jerusalem because they are the team of Likud. There aren't many teams anywhere else in the world that are so closely related with a single political party. And the problem is that the La Familia remind Likud that their roots are in this extreme right-wing European, the most extreme of European right-wing organizations, in fact, fascist organizations, although I should perhaps add Italian fascism was always the model rather than German fascism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would agree that there's a deep connection between Beitar Jerusalem and the old ideology of Italian fascism. But looking into the network of supporters, you can see how Beitar is also twinned with teams like, particularly in Italy, Lazio, which famously is, sort of connected to fascist organizations. So obviously there's also an international network of these teams who do share the same ideology.
Well, especially Lazio is associated with the port of Rome, I believe, and that's where where Mussolini set up the Beitar training camp. So Beitar literally had a training camp inside the military port of Rome, and they supported Lazio at the time.
Absolutely, and you can get to see the same current themes, like Beitar is anti-Arab, and so Lazio supporters often boo, players of colors, and they criticize the owners for acquiring players from certain backgrounds. So obviously the ideology is very much the same. There's one game that normally in Jerusalem is highly problematic, and this is the game between Beitar and Sakne. Sakne is a team, is a Palestinian team, the only one playing in the top Israeli league from the north. Close to sort of the tip point of the West Bank, not far away from Nazareth and that region, just to geographically locate it. And that game is still, often the cause of large troubles and violence caused by, obviously, Beitar fans and La Familia. I was wondering, have you ever watched live one of those games?
No, and it's a source of disappointment that I haven't. They're difficult to get into. I would have to stand on the in the Jewish side to see them, really, because the Saknin fans have bussed in. You can only get in if you're on a particular coach. So I would have to set off from Saknin, which I really should have done, and I haven't done. I wish I'd. Saknin, I think, aren't the only team in the Premiership at the moment, but they've got the only Arab team in the Premiership at the moment, because the Nazareth team, I believe, are in this season. And Saknin dropped out 2 seasons ago, but bounced back up. And it's true that Saknin are the most successful Palestinian Arab side. They don't play the prettiest football, but clearly it's been effective over a long time. And what's so peculiar about them is that, I mean, the reason that we're having to explain where Saknin is because it's the tiniest place you can imagine. It's a village in the Galilee region, which is the mountainous region that overlooks the lake and is the route over to the coast, Nazareth and Haifa. So it's a tiny, tiny little village that's completely surrounded by what you might call internal settlements. Israel's gone to a lot of trouble to build disparate communities all linked together that take over all of those hills to create a kind of a Judaicized Galilee. So Saknin is separate, very small, and for some reason has managed to build the best football team. It's the result of merging two earlier football sides, and it was just very brilliantly done by a very talented Palestinian Israeli politician for political reasons. Yeah, as all these things are. Politics is always at the heart of everything. He's the mayor of the town.
As we reach the conclusion of the interview, I just wanted to ask you something. Is there anything that I didn't ask, but you want to talk about football in Palestine or Jerusalem that I didn't ask?
I feel that I just taught the hind legs off a donkey. I felt at times as though I was recounting my entire book from memory. So I'm sure that in the middle of the night, I'll wake up and go, oh my God, I didn't talk about that. There's the link, we talked about the link between political parties and football clubs, but in Israel, which prides itself on being the tech startup nation, there's a strong link between tech startups and clubs these days. And the tech billionaires are the people who look likely to be the next generation of politicians in Israel. So I guess if I look forward, I might be exploring that line, but I don't know if I'll write another book.
This was Nicholas Blincoe, author, critic, and screenwriter, but also, author of two very, very important books. One, we mentioned earlier, published in 2017, Bethlehem, Biography of a Town, but more importantly, published in 2019, More Noble Than War, with two titles, one for European audience, The Story of Football in Israel and Palestine, and for the American audience, A Soccer History of Israel-Palestine. Nicholas, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.